The night I arrived in Corvell, a small coastal town buried deep in the remote reaches of New England, a thick fog clung to the shoreline like an unwelcome guest that had overstayed its visit. The air was heavy with moisture, and the salty scent of the ocean permeated everything. The cab driver, an older man with a weathered face, barely spoke a word during the hour-long drive from the nearest train station, as if the mere mention of where we were heading might stir something better left undisturbed. My destination was the Lighthouse, standing alone at the edge of a jagged cliff that overlooked the Atlantic Ocean. The beacon had guided ships to safety for over a century, but now it was my responsibility. The previous keeper, an old man named Elias Finn, had retired after nearly 40 years of service. The town was hesitant to speak of him. When they did, it was in hushed tones, as if his name carried some dark weight. The lighthouse was more imposing than I had imagined. As the cab pulled away, its engine barely a whisper, I stood at the base of the structure, craning my neck to take in its full height. The tower was tall and sturdy, built from ancient stone that had weathered countless storms. The light at the top revolved slowly, a faint but steady beam slicing through the fog. The keeper's house, a small stone cottage attached to the base of the lighthouse, was my new home. Inside, the cottage was exactly what I had expected, simple, functional, and devoid of any personal touches. A small living area with a worn sofa, a kitchenette, and a single bedroom with a bed that creaked ominously when I sat on it. The windows were small and reinforced, perhaps a necessary feature given the location. There was a distinct chill in the air, despite the summer season, and I found myself shivering as I unpacked my belongings. The first night was uneventful, though sleep was elusive. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, and the sound of the waves crashing against the rocks below was constant. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the rhythmic sweep of the lighthouse's beam casting fleeting shadows across the room. The solitude of the place was palpable, a weight that pressed down on me with each passing hour. The next morning, I decided to explore the town and introduce myself to the locals. Corvell was as quiet as it had been the night before. The few people I encountered eyed me with a mix of curiosity and suspicion, their conversations dying as I approached. I visited the general store, run by a middle-aged woman named Margaret, who seemed friendlier than the others but still guarded. She mentioned Elias Finn in passing, her voice lowering as she did. Elias was a good man, but this place, it takes its toll, she said, her eyes drifting towards the window as if she expected to see him standing outside. The lighthouse has its own history. Be sure you're up for it. I nodded, not entirely sure what she meant. It was clear that Corvell had secrets, ones that the townspeople weren't eager to share with an outsider, but I was determined to make the best of it. The lighthouse job was a rare opportunity, one I had been excited to take. I wasn't about to let some small-town superstitions get in the way. As the days passed, I settled into a routine. The lighthouse required constant attention. The lens needed regular cleaning, the mechanism needed winding, and the surrounding grounds had to be maintained. It was hard work, but it kept my mind occupied. The isolation, however, was beginning to wear on me. The loneliness was pervasive, creeping in at odd moments, making me yearn for human contact. One evening, about a week after I had arrived, I was outside tending to the garden when I first noticed it. The feeling of being watched. It was subtle at first, a prickling at the back of my neck, the kind of sensation that makes you turn around, expecting to see someone there. But there was no one, only the empty expanse of the cliff and the vast ocean beyond. I shrugged it off as paranoia. It was easy to let your imagination run wild in a place like this. The isolation, the endless fog, and the eerie silence could do that to a person. But over the next few days, the feeling persisted. It was as if someone or something was observing me from the shadows, just out of sight. One night, while doing my rounds in the lighthouse, I thought I saw a figure standing at the edge of the cliff, near the fence that separated the property from the sheer drop to the ocean below. My heart skipped a beat, and I rushed down the spiral staircase, my footsteps echoing in the narrow space. When I reached the bottom and burst through the door, the figure was gone. The only sound was the wind whipping through the tall grass. I searched the area, my flashlight cutting through the mist, but found nothing. No footprints, no sign that anyone had been there at all. I told myself it was just a trick of the light, an illusion created by the fog and my overactive imagination. But deep down, I knew it was something more. The nights grew longer, the darkness more oppressive. The fog, which had once seemed merely atmospheric, now felt suffocating, as if it were closing in on me. The sound of the waves became more ominous, a constant roar that filled the air, drowning out all other noise. And then the voices began. At first, they were faint, indistinct murmurs that I could barely make out over the wind and the sea. I thought they were coming from the town, maybe people talking on the docks or in the streets. But as the nights wore on, I realized the voices were closer, much closer. They seemed to emanate from the lighthouse itself, or perhaps from the ground beneath it. One night, as I was lying in bed, trying to fall asleep, I heard them more clearly. They were whispering, speaking in low, urgent tones. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but the sound sent chills down my spine. I got up and searched the cottage, but there was no one there. The whispers seemed to follow me, moving from room to room just out of reach. I tried to ignore them, telling myself it was the wind playing tricks on me, but the voices grew louder, more insistent. They invaded my dreams, turning them into nightmares from which I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding in my chest. The line between reality and dreams began to blur, and I found myself dreading the nights, afraid of what I might hear or see. Desperate for answers, I decided to look into Elias Finn's life. Perhaps there was something he had left behind that could explain the strange occurrences. I searched the cottage, going through old drawers and cupboards, and eventually I found it. A worn, leather-bound journal, hidden in a false bottom of a drawer in the bedroom. The journal was filled with Elias's thoughts and experiences during his time as the lighthouse keeper. As I read through the entries, I began to understand why the townspeople had been so hesitant to speak of him. Elias had been a rational man, not prone to flights of fancy, but over time the isolation and the strange happenings had taken their toll on him. The early entries were mundane, detailing the daily upkeep of the lighthouse and the changing weather. But as the years went on, the tone of the journal shifted. He wrote about the same feeling of being watched, of seeing figures in the mist, and of hearing voices in the night. He described vivid nightmares, visions of the ocean rising up to swallow the lighthouse whole, and of shadowy figures standing at the foot of his bed, whispering things he couldn't understand. One entry in particular stood out to me. It was dated just a few weeks before his retirement. There is something in the lighthouse, something ancient and malevolent. I can feel it watching me, waiting. The voices are growing louder, more demanding. They speak of the sea, of the darkness beneath it. I fear I am losing my mind, but I know what I have seen, what I have heard. This place is cursed, and I am its prisoner. Whoever comes after me, beware. The lighthouse demands a keeper, but it also demands something more. The word sent a shiver down my spine. Was Elias trying to warn me? And if so, what exactly was he warning me about? The voices, the figures in the mist, were they real, or was I, like Elias, succumbing to the isolation and the fear? As the weeks went on, the strange occurrences intensified. The figures I had seen in the mist began to appear more frequently, always at the edge of my vision, always disappearing when I tried to approach. The voices grew louder, more distinct, and I began to understand fragments of what they were saying. They spoke of the sea, of something that lived beneath the waves, something that had been there long before the lighthouse was built. I started having strange dreams, where I was standing at the edge of the cliff, staring out at the ocean. In the dreams, the water was unnaturally still, like a sheet of black glass, and something beneath its surface was calling to me, beckoning me to join it. Each time, I would wake up, just as I was about to step off the cliff, my heart racing, the taste of salt on my lips. One night I woke to find the lighthouse's light had stopped turning. The mechanism had jammed, something that hadn't happened since I had arrived. I rushed to the top of the tower, my flashlight flickering as I climbed the stairs. When I reached the top, I found the lens shattered, shards of glass scattered across the floor. As I bent down to examine the damage, I felt a cold breath on the back of my neck, followed by a low, guttural whisper. I spun around, but there was no one there, only the empty room and the faint echo of the wind outside. But I knew what I had heard. The voice had spoken a single word: soon. I knew then that I couldn't stay in Corvell any longer. The lighthouse, the town, they were all wrong. Something ancient and evil had taken root here. Something that fed on the isolation and fear of those who came to keep the light. Elias had known it, and now I did too. I packed my belongings and prepared to leave. But as I stood at the door of the cottage, I hesitated. The fog outside was thicker than ever, a dense wall of white that obscured everything beyond a few feet. The town, the road, even the cliff, everything had disappeared into the mist. And then I heard the voices again, louder and more insistent than ever. They were all around me, inside the cottage, inside the lighthouse, inside my head. They spoke of the sea, of the darkness beneath it, of the endless hunger that dwelled there, waiting for its next victim. I ran outside, desperate to escape, but the fog closed in around me, blinding me, disorienting me. I stumbled towards the cliff, my footsteps muffled by the thick blanket of mist. The voices grew louder, more urgent, and I realized with a jolt of terror that they weren't just speaking to me, they were calling me. "Join us," they whispered. "It's your turn." I reached the edge of the cliff and looked down at the ocean below. The water was black and still, just like in my dreams, and something beneath its surface was moving, shifting. The fog swirled around me, and I felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to step off the cliff, to let the ocean take me, to join whatever it was that waited beneath the waves. But then, through the fog, I heard a different voice, faint but familiar. It was Elias. His voice cut through the whispers, the fog, the darkness, and for a moment, I was able to think clearly. I took a step back, then another, until I was away from the edge, the pull of the ocean weakening. The fog began to lift, just slightly, and I saw the faint outline of the town in the distance. The voices faded, replaced by the sound of the wind and the waves. I turned and ran, not stopping until I reached the town square, where the few remaining lights shone dimly through the mist. I left Corvell that night, abandoning my post at the lighthouse. I didn't care what the townspeople thought, didn't care about the job or the responsibilities. I just needed to get away, to put as much distance between myself and that cursed place as possible. I never returned to Corvell, never looked back, but the memories of that place still haunt me, the voices still echo in my mind, and sometimes late at night, I dream of the lighthouse and the dark, still ocean that waits below it. Elias Finn was right. The lighthouse demands a keeper, but it also demands something more, and I fear someday it will come calling for me again.